pushing away her husband to the point of making him believe he was worthless, pushing away her daughter with empty promises, pushing away her son with her anger. This had achieved nothing. She hated herself. She had forced her husband to deal with a painful reality all by himself. She had accused him of cheating when he did deal with it. She had condemned everything he did, had insulted him, had mocked him, had convinced him that he wasn't a fit parent. Of course he wanted to kill himself. Anyone in his position would. But not on her watch. She turned the parchment over and scribbled out her own note. She then carefully tied it to Pipsqueak's leg. Get this message to Hiccup as soon as you can. Please. It's so important. She got out some dragon nip from her satchel and fed it to the terror. Please make sure he reads it. Please. The terror warbled in understanding before taking off into the sky. Astrid watched her fly until she disappeared into the horizon. The sun was setting as Hiccup and Fishlegs finally found the home of the man who had bought Berkshire. Fishlegs could see his friend stiffen the closer they got. He looked over at Toothless, who seemed concerned about his rider's rigid form. He cooed quietly, but Hiccup paid him no heed. Meatlug focused on the ground as she walked, reluctant to witness yet another altercation. She had a feeling that this one would be worse than any of the others. Hiccup was giving her a very strong negative vibe and she didn't like it one bit. As they approached the house, a man walked out, leaning against a cane as he limped over to her outdoor chair. He had a rather beautiful garden. Hiccup tensed as he realized just how that garden was kept beautiful. Slave labor. He wanted to vomit. You, he bellowed, running up to the vile man with his fists balled so tightly his fingernails cut into his palms. You bought my son. I bought no one's son, the man said in an unnervingly calm voice. You are mistaken. Get off my land. I am not leaving until I have my son. Hiccup snarled, approaching the man with alarming speed. Several people saw you buy a little Norse boy with red hair. Funnily enough, I have a little boy with red hair. And no one takes him away from me. I pay good money for him. He is my property. The man stood up. If you even think about taking him, I will have you thrown into prison for theft. Hiccup, he can do that. Fishlegs said, putting a hand on his friend's shoulder. Hiccup grabbed the front of the man's shirt, yanking him toward his face. Now you listen to me, you son of a bitch. Fishlegs blanched. He had never heard Hiccup use words like that. If you do not relinquish my son, I will kill you. You see that dragon over there? He's a night fury. And he never misses. The man eyed the dragon, his eyes widening slightly. He then turned his head to face his assailant. Fine. I make a deal with you. But only if you put me down. Hiccup obliged, dropping the man rather roughly to the ground. It took a considerable amount of effort for the man pick up his cane, but no one even thought about helping him. He then turned back to Hiccup. You come back tomorrow, he said, brushing himself off. Absolutely not. You come back tomorrow or I won't sell. That is my offer, you may take it or leave it, the man snapped, sounding almost indignant. Hiccup, we should just listen to him. Fishlegs said, approaching his friend the way he'd approach an irate monstrous nightmare. We've got our supplies, we can set up camp for the night. Hiccup was trembling with rage, but even he could see the logic in Fishlegs' words. We will be back at dawn, he hissed before turning on his heel and walking into the lush forest near the house. Fishlegs hurried to keep up. Hiccup didn't break his pace until the house was out of sight. It seemed he didn't even want to think about the vile place his son was living. And if the man could see them, he might rescind his offer. One more night without my son, he muttered angrily as he set up the tent. One more stupid night. Only one, Hiccup. And then he'll be free. Fishlegs put a hand on his friend's shoulder. Yeah. Whatever. Hiccup finished setting up the tent. He grabbed his blankets from the carrying cases tied to his dragon. You're going to bed. What else is there to do? Stay up and talk. I just want to get this over with. Hiccup growled, placing the blankets on the bottom of the tent before placing his head on his pillow. You just want this problem to go away so you can send Finn home and then deal with your pain. Fishlegs crawled into the tent and sat on his knees next to his friend. But I'm not leaving you here. And neither is Finn. I am not going to have this conversation with you again. Hiccup turned around and placed his blanket over his head. This is for your own good. Just drop it. There's nothing you or anyone can do for me. Let it go, fish legs. Hiccup placed his hand over his exposed ear and tried to sleep. If he was going to be up at dawn, he was going to have to be asleep earlier than usual. Fish legs stared at the hiccup-sized lump under the blankets before sighing and unfolding his own. As he crawled into them, he looked skyward. Please. He prayed, his heart aching. Please help him. The silence of the forest was rather oppressive. Not knowing whether or not his prayer would be answered, he burrowed into his blankets and fell asleep within minutes. Agonizing pain ripped through his chest as he lay there, Dager the deranged triumphantly leering down at him. A burst of strength Hiccup didn't know he had coursed through him and he sat up. Dager stared at him in shock. What? Hiccup opened his mouth to speak but no sound emerged. He couldn't take a life. Not Dager's, not anyone's. He would never be able to live with himself. Dager, listen to me, he breathed, the pain almost too intense for him to handle. You don't have to do this. We don't have to kill anyone. Please, we can work something out. Dager grinned with glee. I don't think so, he said, baring his teeth as he slipped another dagger from its sheath and, before Hiccup could react, plunged it into his stomach. Blood began to pour out of Hiccup's mouth. His body jolted several times. He was choking, his vision was blurring, and then he was floating. Looking down on the body, which rested on his dragon's back. His body. His corpse. He was dead. Dager had won. Notes. The memory tree is actually something from an earlier one-shot I haven't posted here. My apologies. Chapter 14, If. Chapter text. It was surreal to follow his dragon back to land, his blood pouring out of a body that no longer contained him. Hiccup's heart, or whatever he had now, raced uncontrollably. His senses were still in perfect working order. He could hear every sound, see every detail clearer than he ever had before. His essence traveled without his consent, not even allowing him to close his eyes long enough to blink, as he descended upon a cliff face on Brawn. Hiccup. The voice tore through his ears like he had been stabbed yet again. Astrid rushed forward, knocking people out of the way as the body fell to the ground. Astrid, he called. I'm here. Astrid. His wife fell to her knees beside his body, oblivious to his frantic voice. She gently lifted the head, allowing the blood from his slack mouth to trickle onto her skirt as she placed it on her lap. Her shaking fingers began to stroke his thick brown hair. Hiccup, she whimpered. Please talk to me. He's dead, you fool. Dager cackled, sliding expertly off of the Night Fury, who had begun to roar. Just like you knew he would be. Tears poured out of Astrid's eyes as she cradled her husband's limp head in her lap. No. No. No, she wept. Astrid. Hiccup cried as loudly as he could, his voice straining. Astrid. That's enough blubbering. Dager grabbed her upper arm and yanked her up, causing Hiccup's head to collide with the ground at their feet with a solid thud. You are mine now. Astrid spat in his face. Dager lifted a hand and struck her with a reverberating slap. The hooligans roared with anger and suddenly all hell broke loose. Swords clashed, blood splattered, berserkers and hooligans alike fell to the ground in death. Hiccup screamed in horror as he watched a berserker solid a plunger sword into Snotlout's stomach. His friend gasped in shock. He stood, then wavered and fell to knees, blood pouring from his fatal wounds. Toothless roared angrily, trying to take out as many berserkers as he could, but Dager ducked below him. Toothless. Hiccup warned frantically. But his dragon couldn't hear him. Hiccup watched helplessly as Dager thrust his sword into the Night Fury's neck. His best friend cried out in immense pain, his vibrant green eyes wide and fading. He staggered for a moment before he fell limply to the ground. Blood seeped underneath the body. "Noo!" Hiccup wailed, tears pouring out of his invisible eyes. Toothless. Dager let out a delighted cackle as he leered over his prize before turning to watch the battle before him. Hiccup followed his gaze just in time to witness Fishlegs fall to a berserker. A familiar battle cry diverted his attention. Gobber was surrounded by 3 burly berserker soldiers and was killed within seconds. Hiccup turned to watch Rough Nut be slashed open from the shoulder to the waist, gutted like a hunted animal. Tough Nut died with a yell. Hiccup watched his childhood friend's head roll away from his body. The deceased chief scanned the battlefield and watched hooligan after hooligan brutally slaughtered. Soon the cliff was awash with the blood of Hiccup's people. At the end of the battle, the entire hooligan council, minus Astrid, was slain, and only 3 berserker soldiers were left. Meatheads who fought alongside Burke were struck down as well. Sigrid, the 2-week-old baby born to Kara and Frederick, became the youngest chief Braun had ever seen. Well, Dager said cheerfully, now that that's over. Within a sudden, harsh movement, he grabbed Astrid around the waist. Come, my bride, we have to make a quick stop to pick up your offspring before we sail back to Berserker Island. I won't go anywhere with you. Astrid shrieked, pushing herself out of Dager's grip. Her voice trembled and tears soaked her face. Oh, you will. Dager grabbed the front of her shirt and lifted her so that she looked him straight in the eye. Or the kids die. Got it. Astrid remained silent, her jaw clenched. Dager brought her closer to his face. Got it. She nodded, squeezing her eyes shut so she didn't have to look at him anymore. Hiccup tried to run to her but found himself weighted to the spot. He watched helplessly as Dager let out one last guffaw before waving her away. She was carried by 2 of the remaining berserkers, still struggling and screaming, away from the body. Hiccup could still hear her cries even when she was out of sight. Dager watched with satisfaction before turning around to face Toothless. Ah, mine at last, he simpered. What shall I take first? How about the head? He grabbed an axe and raised it over the Night Fury's head. And then the cliff dissolved. Hiccup was now standing in an unfamiliar house. Above the mantel was a large skull, its features immediately recognizable. Instinctively, he strode forward, finding himself mobile again, and inspected it. Toothless, he whimpered. The door behind them burst open. Dager led Astrid by the hair as he stomped into the house. He threw her to the ground. Her face and exposed arms were bruised. She gazed at him with such malice, hatred the likes of which Hiccup had never seen before. Think you can just bump me off? Dager kicked her in the stomach. Hiccup lunged to punch him but was horrified when his hand went directly through Dager's skull. He growled in rage. Both Dager and Astrid still couldn't see him. I don't know what you're talking about. Astrid hissed through her teeth. Dager turned to a berserker guard looming in the doorway. Bring me the girl, he demanded before turning his hate-filled gaze to his wife. Hiccup nearly vomited in his mouth at the thought. If you didn't do anything to my food, you shouldn't have any problem with your precious little girl sampling it first. Astrid's eyes widened and her breath caught in her throat. Hiccup's heart stopped. His body began to tremble as a feeling of dread swept through him. Addie, he whimpered, more tears falling from his eyes. Moments later, his daughter was dragged in by a rough-looking berserker solider. Her arm was clasped around a bloody rag doll that Hiccup almost didn't recognize. The little girl was dressed in rags that barely covered her and did nothing to keep her warm. Every inch of her dirty body was covered in cuts and bruises. She was missing several teeth. Adriana looked up at Dager, her green eyes wide with terror. Hiccup couldn't move. It was like weights had been attached to his feet, drawing him down and refusing to let up even for a second. He wanted to rip Dager limb from limb. The most important people in his life, people he would die for in an instant, were suffering a fate worse than death. He didn't know where they had found his little girl, but Dager's horrific statement from mere days before rang in his ears. She looked like she had become the very thing she clutched in her arms. Berserker soldiers suddenly lunged forward and grabbed Astrid's arms. She struggled against them as Dager grabbed her little girl by the hair and forced her over to the table. He stuck her face in the hot soup and Hiccup heard a squeak from her throat as she tried to pull her head out before she drowned. Okay. I poisoned it. Astrid screamed, struggling against the men holding her back. I won't do it again, just let my daughter go. Hiccup's voice died in his throat or he would have been screaming with her. He couldn't move or speak or close his eyes. He had to helplessly watch from the sidelines. Oh Astrid, don't you know? You need to be punished. Dager simpered, a horrible smile distorting his face. Come on, little girl, eat up. You look so hungry. Adriana shook her head, still too frightened to speak but retaining the stubbornness she had inherited from both her parents. Dager lifted the girl's head from the bowl and was dismayed to see that she had kept her mouth squeezed shut. Hiccup's heart leaped for a moment. His little girl was strong. She had a chance, however remote. Dager threw her face in the soup again. I said eat it, he shouted over Astrid's cries. He finally pulled Adriana out of the soup again. Her mouth was full of the concoction. Hiccup's heart was pounding in his ears. If she swallowed, she would be dead in seconds. Fight him, he pleaded, his breathing labored as he felt his lungs shrink. You can do this, baby. Adriana spat the soup out on the ground. Vegetables and broth hit it with a splatter. Hiccup saw Astrid's look of triumph. He felt the pride of revenge swell in his chest. That's my girl. Dager growled and suddenly grasped Adriana's head and twisted. Astrid's eyes widened. Snap. The little body slumped to the ground, limp as the doll that tumbled from her arms. For a moment, all was silent except the echoes of the sickening snap reverberating in Hiccup's ears. Within seconds, the spell was broken. Hiccup's mouth opened in a silent scream as his feet suddenly gained mobility. He rushed forward and fell to his knees in front of his little girl. Her beautiful green eyes were blank and unfocused. Her head was at a bizarre angle, her features oddly grotesque. No. The scream pierced Hiccup's heart like a dagger. Astrid had been released and she immediately fell to her knees in the place Hiccup was sitting. She picked up the body and shook it. Anna. Addie, baby, please speak to me, she wept, cradling her little girl in her arms and rocking back and forth. Hiccup's voice returned. Though his sobbing should have blurred his surroundings, his vision was perfectly clear as he wailed at the sight of his baby girl's still and unmoving face. The lips that would never break into a smile. The eyes that would never again widen when she was curious. The nose that would never again crinkle ever so much when she was feeling bashful. The throat that would never again emit another giggle, another hiccup. Everything he had done to protect this little girl had been for nothing. He could feel his heart being ripped to shreds. The agony was unbearable. He wanted so badly to close his eyes, to sob and be heard, to hold his baby one more time, yet he could do nothing but stare at her pale face, watch Astrid rock her back and forth, tears falling onto Adriana's face that the girl could never wipe away. Addie. He sobbed, his throat hoarse. My Addie. Dager leaned down in front of Astrid, casting a shadow across the little body. Now you know what will happen if you dare to defy me. Next time, it's your son, he hissed. Astrid's head jerked up. No. You said he would be the heir. Dager began to cackle, shaking his head as if Astrid had told him a very funny joke. Oh Astrid, he said, his voice infuriatingly condescending, do you really think I need your son as my heir? Astrid's eyes widened. What? Dager smirked and straightened up, turning back to his guards. As he walked away, Hiccup's mind began to race. He wanted to decipher the meaning in Dager's words, but Adriana's lifeless form kept flashing in his brain, completely interrupting his thoughts. Without warning, his little girl's body disappeared and the room dissolved into an unfamiliar terrain. Hiccup's feet were weighted to the ground as he watched a large crowd of people in what appeared to be a celebration. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a little boy was being tossed around from one person to another. A woman was being restrained from stepping in to rescue him. The laughter echoed through the trees and into the field. Suddenly, there was a tussle. The boy had done something. He had gotten free. Run, shouted a woman's voice. Astrid's voice. So the little boy could only be. Finn was running as fast as he could toward Hiccup. His father was invisible and rooted to the spot as the boy ran closer and closer. Hiccup got down on his knees to catch him. He was getting nearer, escaping his captors, running with just enough of a head start. But even Finn, as fast as he was for his age, could not outrun a dozen arrows, hatchets and daggers. Hiccup heard the weapons whizzing past him, praying that none would strike his son. But the odds were stacked against him. A single hatchet seemed to soar in slow motion closer and closer to the boy's back. Finn. Hiccup cried. The force of the blade knocked the boy forward. He spat blood and tumbled through Hiccup. Blood poured all over the ground. Finn's eyes were wide with horror, his whole body trembling and choking noises coming from his throat. Mobility returned to Hiccup's feet and he fell forward next to his son. "Finn, buddy, come on," he mumbled through fresh tears. "You can do this, little man. Stay with me." The grass was painted red from the boy's back and mouth. The wide blue eyes blinked over and over, tears falling to the ground and mixing with his blood. The thick, crimson liquid filled his lungs, cascaded down his back. The little body shook for a few seconds more and then went completely still. Hiccup wanted to scream again. He wanted to fall to the ground, to tear out his hair, to release the howls of anguish bursting within him. But he couldn't stop staring into the lifeless face of his son. The eyes that had nearly glowed with excitement on Snoggletog morning or when he got to go on a flight with his poppy were unfocused and still wide with terror. The freckly face that broke into wide smiles was frozen in the expression of agonized pain and abject fear. The body that ran around Burke with a zest for life would never move again. Astrid was running across the field. Hiccup wanted to push her away, to prevent her from seeing her little boy dead on the ground. But he was powerless. The moment her son's body came into focus, she was silent. Almost like she was in a trance, she walked up to it and got on her knees next to his head. Tears were raining down her face, but it was like she had no energy left to scream. Like the torture of losing her husband and daughter had numbed her completely. She reached out a trembling hand and stroked Finn's hair, her sobs almost inaudible. Hiccup wanted to hold her. He wanted to let her punch him until her energy was spent, until she could do nothing but collapse into his arms and cry her heart out. He wanted to cry with her. To go through this together. The look on her face was the most horrible thing Hiccup had ever seen, worse than the dead faces of his children. Astrid had lost the will to live. She was the living embodiment of the death that had just occurred. There was no hope in her eyes, not a single spark of life. She drew breath, her heart still beat, but she was not alive. She had died the second she lost the last member of her family. There seemed to be no transition at all this time. Hiccup was thrown into yet another unfamiliar room. It was night time, probably just before dawn. Dager was lying on a double bed, but Astrid was not lying next to him. There was a rope attached to the bedpost that appeared to have been used to tie Astrid down so that she could not escape. Except that she had. Hiccup's eyes frantically scanned the room and finally found her at the doorway, staring at Dager with dead eyes. There was a knife in her hand, one designed for cutting meat. Suddenly, Hiccup knew what was about to happen. His eyes widened. "Astrid," he whispered, stepping forward. "You don't have to do this." Astrid's eyes remained focused on Dager's sleeping form. She breathed through her teeth, making strange hissing noises with both inhales and exhales. She took a step forward. "Astrid," Hiccup said in a much louder voice. "Think about what you're doing." His words had absolutely no impact on his young wife. Her hands shook, but her expression was determined. She soon reached the bed and raised the knife. "Astrid." The woman slammed the blade into Dager's chest. Dager awoke with a scream as his blood poured from his wound and then from his mouth. "You killed them!" Astrid screamed, raising the knife and plunging it into his stomach. "You killed my family, you sick son of a bitch!" Dager tried to say something, but his blood choked him. His eyes were wide with horror. "How does it feel?" Astrid howled. "How does it feel to lose everything?" She viciously slammed the blade into his belly. Blood gushed from the body, which was now completely still. But Astrid wasn't finished. She held the knife in both her hands and stabbed him over and over, her fingers now coated in his blood and slipping up and down the hilt. She let out an enraged scream the likes of which Hiccup had never heard come from anyone. He didn't know a human being could make a sound so haunting. At long last, Dager's body was unrecognizable and Astrid was covered from head to toe in his blood. She let the knife slip from her fingers and drop with a clatter to the ground. Then she turned toward the door and walked, as if in a trance, out of it and down the stairs. Hiccup followed her as she emerged from the house, walking into the slowly rising sun. The blood seemed to shine in its light. They walked for a minute, finally reaching a cliff. Hiccup's heart clenched as Astrid walked to the edge and looked down. Astrid. He whined, reaching out his arms. Astrid. No. She couldn't hear him. A look of complete serenity crossed over her face, still smudged with blood. I'm sorry, she breathed, looking into the sky. But there's nothing left. Astrid. Hiccup sobbed, his vision clear but his eyes streaming tears that he could feel dripping off his face. A tiny smile brightened Astrid's features. You always did like free falling, she said, winking to the sky. Astrid. Hiccup's feet were once again weighted to the ground as he watched his wife fall forward and disappear off the edge. He let out a scream so loud and long, he knew his voice would be destroyed were he alive. His whole family was dead. Everyone he had ever cared about. All because he hadn't killed one man. Hiccup fell to his knees by the cliff, sobbing like he had never sobbed before. He didn't care that his voice echoed in his ears. He didn't care that his tears completely soaked the front of whatever garment he was wearing. He didn't care that he was pulling out fistfuls of his hair. I'm sorry, he wailed, looking up at the sky. I take it back. I'll kill him. Do you hear me? I'll kill him. Aside from his voice, there was absolute silence. It was as if all the noise, the waves of the ocean below, the trees blowing in the wind, the birds singing, everything was muted completely. As if Hiccup had gone deaf to everything except for his own voice. He could finally shut his eyes, only to open them a moment later. Adriana's dead, blank eyes stared at him. Finn's blood splattered over his vision. He could see them. They surrounded him, followed him. He couldn't escape for even a second. I'll make it right, he wept. Please, please give me another chance. A hand suddenly gripped his shoulder. With a scream of terror, Hiccup bolted upright and nearly slammed into an unknown force looming over him. His fists swung instinctively before his eyes landed on the terrified green eyes of his Night Fury, who was very much alive, and Fish Legs, who stared at him with a look of shock, terror and distress. Chapter 15, The Cave. Chapter text. It took several seconds for Hiccup's eyes to adjust to the lamplight in the tent. They were filled to the brim with tears and sweat. His clothes were soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, his breathing shaky and ragged, his whole body trembling. This was the worst nightmare he had ever had. He put his hands up to his temples and closed his eyes. But the images he had just seen, as clear as if they were happening right at that moment, continued to flash at him until he was certain he would go insane. Hiccup, are you okay? Do you need anything? Fish Legs muttered softly over Hiccup's panting. Hiccup nodded. Water, he choked, his throat sore and scratchy from his screaming. Fish Legs immediately grabbed the closest skin of water he could find and handed it to his friend. Hiccup drank it down within seconds and wiped his mouth, still panting but at least feeling like he could speak properly. Tears continued to pour out of his eyes as he grabbed a nearby cloth and wiped down his forehead. Toothless cooed quietly and nuzzled his human's shoulder. Once most of his sweat had been wiped off his body, Hiccup threw his arms around his dragon. Toothless, but, you're okay. He whispered, sniffling and gently stroking the Night Fury's neck. There was a long pause as Hiccup continued to cry quietly into the dragon's scales. Toothless made a comforting sort of croon and snuggled up to the distressed human. For a while, there was complete silence aside from Hiccup's intermittent sniffles. Meatlug stuck her head into the tent, her eyes wide and directed at her pale human. Fish Legs beckoned her over and rubbed her behind the ears. She licked his face, hoping that her little bit of affection would be enough to calm him down. She didn't like it when her human was upset. And she definitely didn't like the screams she had heard a few minutes previously. Fish Legs stared at his friend as he cuddled up to his dragon. Hiccup clutched the Night Fury's neck as though letting go or loosening his hold would throw him back into his nightmare. His whole body trembled, his eyes were wide and unfocused. The burly Viking had been awakened by Hiccup's cries for Astrid and had desperately tried to wake his chief as he then cried out for his dragon and then his children. Fish Legs didn't know why Hiccup had pleaded before finally awakening, but he was almost too frightened to want to find out. At long last, Hiccup's cries died down. He finally looked at Fish Legs, still stroking his dragon's neck as he did so but not clutching as hard as before. Are they always that bad? Fishlegs ventured, hoping that Hiccup wouldn't lash out at him or start crying again. "And never that be bad?" Hiccup mumbled in a shaking voice. "Do you want to talk about it?" Fishlegs asked, scooting forward slightly. "It might help if you get it all out." "That's what I do when I'm upset." Hiccup nodded, adjusting himself so that he was now leaning against his dragon's stomach. Toothless protectively curled his body around his human. It took several seconds before Hiccup found the strength to speak. As he recounted the horrible images he had watched, Fishlegs paled and his hands flew to his mouth. When Hiccup came to the part of the dream when he had watched Toothless die, he stroked his dragon again and a few tears leaked from his eyes. But it was recounting the fate of the children that appeared to be the hardest. It was all he could do not to burst into tears once more as he choked out their individual fates. As he spoke, he silently prayed to all the gods he knew of that his children were still alive. That his daughter was home safe and that his son would be within a day or two. He would do anything, anything at all to save them from the events he had seen. His head began to ache from the strain, both emotional and physical, he had experienced in the last hour. Fishlegs was completely silent throughout the dream's retelling. He couldn't allow his mind to wander even for a second for fear that his brain would conjure up the most horrible images imaginable. Sweet Adriana dressed in filthy rags and taken advantage of before being murdered on an impulse, Finn, the fearless boy who had such a zest for life, frozen in the last expression his face ever took, fear and pain. He certainly didn't feel about them the way he felt about his own children, but watching the twins grow up and supporting the family during the darkest of times gave him a strong affection for them. He remained silent for a few minutes longer to organize his thoughts and think of something encouraging to say, given the situation. Hiccup squirmed uncomfortably after a bit before interrupting the silence in an emotionally raspy voice. "Please say something. Before I lose my mind." Fishlegs took several deep breaths, resting a hand on his dragon, who nuzzled it affectionately. I don't know what to say." Hiccup rubbed his forehead, trying to relieve the throbbing. He had to think, would he really go back in time and give Dager a chance to live? Would he rather die instead? Leave his family to that future? What future? All it was pain and abuse and mockery, and it wasn't just his family, it was his friends. His eyes suddenly widened. Gobber, Snotlout, Fishlegs, the Thorsten twins, they sacrificed themselves, died at the hands of the Berserkers. They left children fatherless and motherless in the attempt to preserve Berk and the Haddock heritage. They had been afraid in their lack of support, but they weren't unfaithful or disloyal. In fact, they were as close to loyal as loyalty could come. Understanding clicked in his mind and a heavy weight suddenly lifted from his shoulders. He felt his eyes focus and his muscles relax. It was worth it. Killing a man was the most horrible, heinous thing he had ever done. But if it meant his village was safe from the bonds of a terrible clan, it was worth it. If it saved his little boy and girl from the world's most disgusting forms of abuse, it was worth it. If it saved Astrid from Dager's constant torture through physical and emotional abuse, hell, even protecting her from watching her own children die before her eyes and becoming a murderer herself, without a shadow of a doubt, it was worth it. Hiccup looked at his prosthetic with an exhausted look of shame. "I'm a fool." Through his peripheral he noticed his friend look up at him. "I've been so bent out of shape these 2 years for killing a man, when really, if I hadn't, he would have destroyed everything, everything near and dear to me." Hiccup huffed and buried his face in his hands. "I disgust myself." "Well, Hiccup, if it's any consolation, I understand why you felt the way you did," Fishlegs said in a gentle voice. "But you did what you had to do. And we all commend you for that. The question is, what are you going to do now?" Hiccup paused, contemplating his question. For the first time in ages he felt calm, relaxed, passionate instead of cold, formidable by not murderous. For the first time in a long time, Hiccup felt like himself. He felt free. But he also felt something else. A new burden had fallen on his shoulders, this one lighter and, he realized, one he had put there himself. He took a deep, shaking breath, the throbbing in his head coming back full force as the weight of what he had done to his family crashed over him. "There really isn't anything I can do," he admitted, placing his fingers on his temple. I'm divorced. I'm probably going to come back to find my job being taken over by someone else. As for the kids, well, they'll be gone too. I have done to my family, in a way, what Dager would have done. Maybe not so violently, but I ripped the people I love to pieces. Fishlegs nodded solemnly. It's true that you've done a lot of damage and you may no longer be allowed to be chief of Burke. But you can still mend those relationships. With the kids, maybe. Probably. Hiccup breathed a humorless laugh, a few tears escaping his eyelids once more. But Astrid. No. Forgiveness is too much to ask. Fishlegs shook his head. See, I don't think so, he said with a smile. I think she's holding out for the man she fell in love with. So it's up to you now. You can let her walk away or you can come barreling after her with an apology and probably a new weapon of some sort. Because that's what you do. Both of you. Hiccup gave his friend a wistful smile but shook his head so vehemently, his dark hair was tousled. Thanks for that, Fish, but I don't think it's possible. She hates me. It would be better if I just tried to see the kids and leave her alone. She might end up killing me with her bare hands. You don't know that. Fishlegs insisted. Astrid loves the man she married. Still loves him. And it's not so hard to become that man again. All you have to do is make sure she knows just how sorry you are. All speculation. Hiccup raised a finger. But you don't know her like I do. Once she's been pushed this far, there's no going back. Hiccup, what I'm about to say may be the most important thing I've said since we left Burke. Fishlegs said, his eyes boring into Hiccup's. I think you're wrong. Hiccup chortled. I was expecting something more profound. Fishlegs suggested. Hiccup shrugged. Something like that. Fishlegs was happy to hear his friend's laugh but he scowled. I'm serious. Hiccup took a deep breath, the laughter within finally released. I think I'm going to go outside to get some air. Burke's chief grabbed a lantern and stepped out of the tent. He appreciated the cool breeze that met him the moment he was outside. He sat down and stared at the sky, waiting for the sun to ascend and bathe the forest in a little bit of light. There was a long stretch of silence. The lantern flickered, illuminating the wood in the tiny bit of light it provided. Suddenly, there was a squawk. Hiccup looked up and saw an outline of a dragon in the sky before he caught sight of it in the lamplight. Pipsqueak, he asked, genuinely confused. What are you doing here? The terrible terror landed on his shoulder and stuck out her foot. Hiccup quickly untied the note and instructed the little dragon to go find Fishlegs for a reward. He unfolded the paper and raised an eyebrow at Fishlegs' untidy scrawl. What in the world? He muttered to himself, turning the paper over. And then he stopped. That handwriting was familiar. Uncomfortably familiar. Hiccup was about to call for Fishlegs to take the note, but he stopped. His name was on the top of the paper. He leaned toward the lamplight so that he could read the writing. Hiccup. This mess we've gotten ourselves into was my fault. I pushed you away, I didn't listen to you when you needed someone to confide in, to talk to, and I became impatient when you started to distance yourself from me. I can see now that you were in a lot of pain and I ignored it, hoping it would go away. But it didn't. And I made things so much worse for you by forcing you to deal with all of this on your own. I know you're probably still angry and never want to see me again. But if there's anything I can say that can get through to you, please come home. I need to speak to you and Audrey is doing so well. She needs to see her daddy again. Just, please come home. Please find Finn and bring him home safe. I hope to see you both soon. Astrid. Astrid's writing became smudged as it captured the tears now raining from her husband's eyes. Hiccup wanted to read the note again but he couldn't see clearly enough to make out the letters. It didn't matter. Astrid wanted him back. The gods had given him a second chance he hadn't deserved. He clutched the letter to his chest as the tears flowed. She wants me, she still wants me, he heard himself murmuring through the tears. He felt like his heart would burst with joy. The love of his life didn't hate him. She wanted to see him. Fishlegs, hearing the fresh sobs from the outside, bounded out of the tent only to see his friend lovingly tracing the outlines of the letters his wife had written, almost like he was caressing her face. Hiccup beamed up at him, tears still falling but eyes alight with happiness. She still wants me. Hiccup looked back at the paper with a short laugh, smoothing out the lines on the paper. Why did I ever doubt you? Because you're stubborn. And that's how I know our Hiccup is back. Fishlegs chuckled, gently tugging the note from Hiccup's hand. I told you she was going to forgive you. Hiccup paused to wipe his face off with the collar of his shirt. Unless she ends up punching me in the face as soon as I get there. But I won't assume things or doubt her. She seems pretty honest. Here he took the note back and gently tapped it with his forefinger. Fishlegs looked up just in time to see a small reddish hue on the horizon. Dawn had come at last. He turned back to Hiccup, whose green eyes shone with optimism and hope, and felt his heart leap with happiness. There was no doubt in his mind that the Hiccup everyone had so sorely missed was back at last. It was almost a surreal experience to watch his friend and chief stand tall and proud as he once did, before turning towards him with a daring smirk. Let's go get my son. Fishlegs felt like embarking on their quest right away, but he paused for a moment. After you change clothes. Can't hug Finn in that sweaty shirt. Hiccup looked down at the damp cloth clinging to his chest. No, I guess not. He let out a laugh. Thanks, Mom, he added as he crawled into the tent. Hiccup threw on his last clean shirt, his only one with buttons down the front, and a fresh pair of pants. Sweaty, sticky clothes weren't comfortable, and he wasn't about to subject his son to that just because he was too impatient to take a moment to change. He emerged from the tent with a wide grin and packed his things as quickly as he could. Fishlegs helped, relishing the sounds of his friend's laughter. Once their bags were packed and tied to their dragons, who were in much better spirits now that their humans were happy, they walked toward Rattri's residence. Rather, Fishlegs walked. Hiccup's cheerfulness seemed to envelop him completely, so he skipped merrily along, not at all caring about how silly he looked. Toothless delightedly bounded beside him, hopping about and hoping that his human would play with him later. It had been far too long. His wish was granted seconds later when Hiccup picked up a branch. Go long, he shouted, pitching it as far as he could. Toothless galloped after it and caught it in midair. He then ran back to his human, walking backwards so that Hiccup wouldn't have to break his stride. Hiccup reached for the branch, but his dragon growled and moved it out of his reach. Oh, so that's how it's going to be. Hiccup chirped, lunging for the stick. Give it back, you big lizard. Toothless growled again, grinning as his human continued to narrowly miss the edges of the stick. Hiccup suddenly bolted forward and dived at his dragon, grabbing the reptile around the neck. Toothless snorted in amusement and lifted himself so that his human dangled off of him. Let me have it. Hiccup shouted, laughing as he tried to climb up Toothless' neck. Toothless rumbled his stubborn refusal. Fishlegs was doubling over, laughing at the pair. It was like Hiccup was 15 again, roughhousing with his dragon in the most undignified way possible. Not that anyone minded, of course. They arrived at Rattri's residence far too soon. The smiles faded as they arrived. Rattri was nowhere to be seen, but an elderly man sat outside the house, smiling kindly as they approached. The elderly man slowly stood, the marks on his body visible from the hooligan's vantage point. The men couldn't help the simultaneous rise of anger in their chests at the obvious abuse the old man had endured. Before either man could speak, the elderly man stepped forward and bowed low. Hello gentlemen, it is good to meet you at last. Hiccup and Fishlegs shared a look as the man stood straight. They tensed when he held Hiccup's hand in his and shook it gingerly. At last? Hiccup asked. Yes, sir. The Night Fury, the descriptions match. You are Strong Finn's father, Hiccup Horrendous Haddock, the third chief of Burke. Hiccup blinked several times, surprised at this man's observations. Finn's talked about me. Although he ran from you originally, he missed you more than anyone would realize, even himself. The man smiled warmly, still lightly patting Hiccup's large freckled hand. And you are, sorry, what's your name? Where are my manners? The man tittered lightly. My name is Binen. I, too, have been working for Rattri. Hiccup couldn't help but feel the warmth of the slave's personality, a man who probably suffered day in and day out. It was refreshing and again made him feel a tad guilty for being so petty. But he had to move on. He cast aside his thoughts and urgently asked, "Where is he? And how is he?" "Your son is a little worse for wear, but he'll pull through. You've named him well. He's a fearless lad. So much spirit. You should have seen him when he was 3. Hiccup said cheerfully. Benin joined in his laughter. "He has been a light to me in this dark place, these few days. But I could not be more happy that soon, he will be free." Hiccup smiled at him graciously and patted his shoulder. "And I'm thankful he had such a great man in the same house as him." He hadn't been talking to this man for 5 minutes, but he knew a good heart when he saw one. "You must be Fish Legs," Benin said, turning to Hiccup's companion. "Finn, understandably, didn't talk about you quite as much, but he says you're a loyal friend of the family." He gestured toward a path leading down a small hill. "Rattray instructed me to walk you to the mines." "Mines?" Hiccup's heart rate quickened as they followed him down the worn path. "I can't pretend I know what he's up to," Benin said, walking alongside them. "But I can tell you that he's a shrewd businessman. And he wouldn't irreparably harm what he considers to be property. Your son will be fine." Hiccup sighed in relief, but paused when a thought struck him. "But I am weary, basically a threat to that. So I can't imagine this exchange will be a walk to the sweets shop." "No," said Benin. "But if Finn's description of you is any indicator, you're not going to give up so easily. He saw that firsthand. If you've learned anything of Finn, I am sure you've noticed he has a strong streak of stubbornness." Benin nodded vehemently with a laugh. "Well, it's been debated who has the most stubbornness, me or his mother." Fish Legs instantly piped up, "Mother." "Oh, I'm sure." Benin chuckled. "She's a woman. Keep an eye on your daughter, she's likely to be the same way." He paused for a moment. "Of course, I mean no disrespect." "Nah." Hiccup waved a hand, the smile still firmly on his face. "I agree with you. Sir, if I may." "Yes, you may call me Hiccup." Benin paused for a moment before a willing smile appeared. "Very well. Hiccup. But if I may, you seem much happier than young Finn described. Was this due to some bitterness on his part, or has something changed?" "That's a bit of a complicated story," Hiccup said with a sigh. "But, to keep it brief, yes, something has most certainly changed. Finn had every right to be bitter. And I'm determined to make it up to him. Well, here's your chance." Benin gestured toward the cave just ahead of them where Rattray was standing. Hiccup's eyes narrowed. "It's a cave, not a mine." "Ah, yes. Rattray was very specific about taking you to this entrance," Benin said, the smile fading from his face at the sight of his master. "I must leave you here. But I am honored to have met 2 of the people Finn was so fond of. And, of course, these magnificent dragons," he added, patting Toothless on the head. Rattray stomped over as fast as he could with his cane. Benin walked away from the hooligans, and when he was in range, was slapped in the face. Hiccup and Fish Legs gaped and had to restrain themselves from attacking the sweet old man's assailant. "You stupid slave! You take too long. You not eat tonight." Rattray glared at the old slave and slapped him again. Benin gingerly lay on the ground before his master, hands nearly touching his feet in a silent plea for forgiveness. The cruel man turned toward the hooligan chief and smirked at him. "You go inside alone." He paused to shoot a look at Toothless, who met his glare with a toothy growl. "No light and no supplies. If you find the boy, I will allow you to buy him for a price. But I hope you are prepared, he was expensive." "I'm prepared for anything," Hiccup said, his voice trembling with rage. He leaned over to help Benin to his feet, but the elderly man shook his head. He sighed deeply. "So just go in and find Finn." "Yes." Rattray pointed to the entrance. "That is all. It seems a little easy." Fish Legs muttered to his friend, eyeing Rattray suspiciously. "If I don't play along, I won't get my son back." "I don't have a choice," Hiccup replied. He turned to the vile man who had bought his son. "I agree to your terms." Hiccup strode forward confidently, entering the darkness of the cave within seconds. Blackness surrounded him as the entrance became smaller and smaller in the distance. Soon there was no light left. He felt along the edges, hoping that Finn would be easy to find. "Finn," he called, his voice echoing around him. "Buddy." There was suddenly a loud rumble from above him. He looked up, though it did no good whatsoever, and suddenly became aware of the sounds of loosening rocks. He took a chance and ran forward into the darkness, tripping over a rock but quickly getting up as rocks fell around him, blocking his way out. He barely escaped the falling boulders, but he knew there was no way he would be able to get out the way he came. His heart constricted painfully. His son hadn't called back. And with the sudden cave-in, was he still alive? His heart stopped completely when he remembered that this was how his father had died. He could barely draw breath, but he forced air into his lungs. "Finn." And still there was no answer. Chapter 16, Free. Chapter text. Finn was awakened just before dawn quite suddenly. Rattray slammed his fist on the door to the room, well, more like a closet, he slept in, and shouted that he was to be up and dressed in the next 2 minutes. Not one to keep the man waiting, Finn hurriedly put on the meager clothes he had and rushed into the main house 30 seconds early. Thankfully, Rattray apparently decided that this was acceptable. "You come with me," the man demanded, shackling Finn to himself and leading him down the path to the mines. Finn didn't dare speak up, but he didn't like being led into the darkness with only a small lamp to illuminate the path. Was he to work there all day today? Did they always start this early? It seemed a bit foolhardy to work in a place as dangerous as a mine during the night hours. Natural sunlight made it a little bit safer. Finn knew that slaves were supposed to be kept alive, but it didn't stop him from worrying about the possible outcome of this outing. Rattray yanked the chain, directing Finn to what he soon realized was the back entrance he'd found the previous day. But rather than stop outside the cave's mouth, the man pulled Finn into its depths. They walked deep into the cave for a long while before Rattray finally stopped, nearly causing Finn to run into him. The boy shuddered at the thought of what the man would do to him if he hadn't caught himself. "Yes, you safe here. Safer than others," Rattray muttered, more to himself than to his young slave. "You sit down. Stay still. No speak. I come back for you." Rattray unlocked the shackle and pushed Finn into a small space between two large boulders. He chuckled to himself as he did so. Finn had no idea what the man was planning, but he did know that it was nasty and, as the light finally left his line of sight, terrifying. He had never been afraid of the dark, but the cave's darkness was so penetrating, he began to shiver with fear. He felt like he had been struck blind, that the cave would be his final resting place. He wondered if this was how his Poppy had felt just before he died. He gritted his teeth and forced the tears down. No crying. He had to be strong. He didn't know how long he sat there. It felt like hours, but probably wasn't quite that long. Suddenly, the boy heard a loud rumble from the direction of the cave's entrance. Rocks and boulders were crashing. It was a cave-in. Finn held on to Rattray's comment that he would be safe where he was. Slaves were to be kept alive, but just to be sure, he curled up and hid his face in his knees as the rumbling continued. Finally, there was dead silence. Finn wondered if he had already died. Could it be that he had been crushed so suddenly he had felt no pain? Was there nothing after life except this black expanse surrounding him? His trembling grew more violent and he prayed that he was still alive. Then, suddenly, he heard a voice. More like an echo of a voice. Its owner was far away but crying out as loud as he could. Finn couldn't make out the words, but the voice itself sounded very familiar. No. Finn shook his head, digging his fingers into his thick hair. He wasn't hearing his father's voice. It was a trick or a hallucination. The result of his sanity finally leaving him. He didn't hear anything, he decided. His mind was all he had left and he was determined to keep it intact as long as he could. The calling voice grew closer. Finn squeezed his eyes shut as he began to be able to make out words. "Finn," called the voice that sounded so much like his father's. "Finn, are you down here? Finn." Finn clutched his hair, pulling it so that he wouldn't cry at the sound he had so desperately wanted to hear. His father was not down there. He couldn't possibly know where Finn had gone. In any case, his father preferred his sister. There was no way at all that his father was down there searching for him. And the steadily louder cries of his name weren't going to work. He wasn't going to succumb to the madness. He put his hands on his ears and whimpered as he breathed, trying desperately not to cry. The sounds of footsteps joined the calls. If Hiccup were really there, he would be quite close. His cries sounded frantic. I'm just hearing what I want to hear, Finn thought. My dad would never be that worried about me. Finn, the voice bellowed, the echoes reverberating in Finn's ears. Please say something, buddy. Finn shook his head, his breathing growing louder so that he could block out the sound. Rattray had told him not to speak. This must have been a test. He didn't know why his master had ordered this, but it was sadistic, even for him. The boy breathed so loudly, the hissing sounds began to echo in addition to the calling voice. Finn, the voice asked, this time staying in one place. Finn, is that you? I can hear you, buddy. Just say something. Finn shook his head, his breathing growing louder so that he wouldn't be able to hear the voice. He wanted so desperately for this to be over. If he hadn't already died, he was beginning to wish that he would instead of being subjected to this torture. He could hear his voice echoing as his whimpering increased in volume. The footsteps ceased and he heard soft padding right up to where he was hiding. Sounds of breathing that weren't his. And then, quite suddenly, a warm hand made contact with his knee. He screamed in surprise. Finn, the voice said in a gentler tone, the breath from its owner's lungs now warming his face, don't be afraid, buddy. I'm here. Finn looked up, his breathing shaky and labored. He couldn't see anything in front of him, but he could smell the familiar leathery scent, feel the callus on the hand's owner. The other hand made contact with his shoulder. He shakily breathed in, his heart pounding so hard he could hear its tiny echoes. Daddy. The hand suddenly pulled him into a warm chest, its heart pounding and creating its own little echoes. His daddy had come for him. Before he could stop it, a sob escaped his throat and tears began to rain out of his eyes and into Hiccup's shoulder. The father pulled his son in closer, holding him so tightly it was almost painful. I'm sorry. Hiccup whispered, stroking Finn's back as gently as he could. I'm so sorry. Finn was incapable of responding coherently. Every emotion he had held back, every time he had wanted to cry, every second he longed for his father's embrace washed over him so that he cried harder than he could remember crying before. Hiccup patiently continued to hold him as tenderly as he could so that he wouldn't aggravate any of the injuries Rattray had inflicted. He could feel some of them through the material of the thin shirt on Finn's back. He wanted to punish Rattray for his cruelty, but not now. Finn was in his arms, safe and sound. Well, safer than he had been in the last few days. It wasn't an ideal setting for a tearful reunion, but as long as he had his son back, Hiccup couldn't care less. The boy's father felt his heart break once more. His son was in tears, in part, because of the monster he had become. His little boy had suffered more than anyone his age should ever have to suffer. Hiccup was reminded of holding Adriana in a similar fashion after her ordeal with Trista. He had felt this way then as well, relieved, overjoyed to have his child back, and horribly guilty for letting them go through it in the first place. A few tears squeezed out of his eyes as well and dripped onto his son's shoulder. If Finn had felt them, he didn't let on. Finally, Finn found his voice. Sniffling loudly, he wiped his face with the back of his hand. How did you find me? He asked, his whole body still trembling. I questioned people. It wasn't so hard to figure out where you were. Hiccup said, helping his son wipe his tears away. Didn't he think I'd see you again? Finn whimpered. I wasn't going to let you slip away from me, buddy. Never. Hiccup pointed to his son's chest and could feel the pounding heart beneath. I love you, Finn. I always have and I always will. You promise? Finn asked in a high voice, tears still streaming out of his eyes. Yes. I promise. I will always come for you. Always. No matter where you are. Hiccup sniffled and smiled, though he knew his son couldn't see it. Finn let out another sob and allowed his father to wipe away his fresh tears. I'm sorry I ran away, he said shakily. Everything was so bad at home. And you told Mom you're a murderer and... I was scared. Oh Finn. Hiccup gripped his son's shoulders, looking where he thought his son's face was, though all he could see was the pitch blackness. Listen, yes, I did kill a man. But the man I killed was going to take you and your mom and sister away and do horrible things to you. He would have taken everything that you and I and our family loved. Our friends, our home, the dragons. Everything. I couldn't let that happen. It's my job to protect you and your mom and sister, and that was the only way I could do it. So you're not going to kill anyone else? Finn asked, his voice sounding slightly more like it always had. I will never kill anyone unless they try to hurt you or our family. Dragons included. Hiccup brushed Finn's bangs out of his eyes. He knew, without knowing how he knew, that they had fallen into his son's line of vision. I didn't want to kill that man. I felt horrible that I did it. But I recently found out what would have happened if I didn't. And it was disgusting. I will never let that happen. Finn sniffled and his breathing became slightly calmer, less shaky. Life is valuable. It is precious. It's irreplaceable, and to take it is a horrible, horrible thing. But to sit back and let someone take it from everyone you love without any remorse, that would be wrong too. Okay. Finn sighed. It's so dark. Yeah, it is. Hiccup stood up, taking Finn's hand and grasping it tightly. The way I came is caved in. I don't know if there's a way out. Finn suddenly gasped. There is, he exclaimed, sounding excited for the first time in days. I've found it before. It's, sort of this way. He tugged Hiccup's hand as they both crept farther into the cave, Finn's hand following the wall. They walked in silence for a while. The eerie echoing of their footsteps gave them the willies, but they wanted to make sure they were silent so that they could hear any coming incident. They shuffled for several minutes when Hiccup's hand suddenly slipped from Finn's. Finn gasped, suddenly terrified, but his fear lasted only a split second. He heard a clang of metal and a loud OF and immediately knew what happened. He burst into peals of laughter. Yeah, laugh at my expense. Hiccup said, keeping his own laughter back as he got up. I see how it is. You're so clumsy, Dad. Finn felt for a moment before finding Hiccup's hand, now covered in dirt. Bah, I meant to do that. Hiccup chortled. Sure you did. Finn said, the grin on his face quite audible. Hiccup. Finn, shouted another very familiar voice from a distance. Are you in there? Are you okay? Hiccup let out a guffaw of relief. We're here, he called. The cave was suddenly filled with the sounds of 4 feet rapidly hitting the ground. Father and son heard a familiar roar, and the cave was suddenly, though briefly, filled with light. Toothless bounded forward, jumping on top of the younger haddock and enthusiastically licking his face. Gah! Finn squealed. I missed you too, you big useless reptile. Toothless snorted in amusement. He allowed Finn to get to his feet before making an inviting gurgling sound. What do you say we escape from this cave in style? Hiccup suggested, squeezing his son's hand. Finn immediately hopped onto the dragon. Hiccup, feeling quite proud of his little son's instincts, climbed atop Toothless behind him. Let's get out of here, Bud, he said, patting the dragon behind the ears. The dragon roared, illuminating the cave ahead of them. He shot forward like an arrow, causing Finn to have to duck down so that he wouldn't be blown backwards onto his father. They were out of the cave in seconds, flying into the sunlight dozens of feet above the ground. They circled the outside of the mines 3 times before landing in front of the disgruntled slave owner. You get lucky. Rattray grumbled. I want price I paid for the boy plus 15%, he demanded in a businesslike tone. Hiccup opened his mouth to argue, and then shut it again. You know what, he said, opening his satchel. Take it all. My son is more important to me than a bunch of metal coins. He threw a bag of money on the ground in front of Rattray. It is a deal. Rattray exclaimed gleefully, picking up the money bag which contained almost double what he had paid for Finn. But I also want to buy Benin. Hiccup added. Him. Rattray turned to the elderly slave, whose eyes were wide in surprise. He is useless. Then you won't have any qualms about letting me have him. Hiccup said in a dangerously low tone, his dragon growling in agreement. Ratri eyed the man, a cold look in his steel-grey eyes. Take him. I don't need useless slaves. I get better, younger ones with this money. Hiccup wanted to vomit at the thought of what he had apparently just paid for, but he choked it down. Benen's eyes filled with tears as he slowly approached Hiccup and Finn. He reached out a trembling hand and grasped Hiccup's. You have been too kind to me, he said, sniffling and wiping his eyes with the back of his other hand. What can I do to repay you? You've already done it. Hiccup smiled and squeezed the man's hand. Now let's go home. Fishlegs suddenly stepped up, making everyone jump. They'd forgotten he was there. I hate to be a downer, he said, not making eye contact with anyone, but how are we going to get Benen back to Burke? He turned to the elderly man. Would you be willing to fly? We can go slowly. Benen looked over at the Gronkle and his face lit up with excitement. It seemed to shave a decade off of him in an instant. I would be most honored, he said, reaching out and gently stroking Meatlug's snout. Heat responum neshit. Ratri said as he walked off, money bag at his waist. Wait. Hiccup called, running after the old man. He stopped in front of him. I just have to do one thing. He snatched the cane out of Ratri's hand and, before the man could react, snapped it in two over his knee. Now you can go. Ratri angrily stomped off, shouting words that Hiccup hoped Finn wouldn't repeat. The father turned back to his son, who stared at him with wide eyes. Hiccup winked and stroked his dragon's snout. However, before they could take off, a woman bounded over, her face alight with excitement. Hiccup and Fishlegs recognized this woman a moment later as the woman they had spoken to the previous day. The woman to whom Fishlegs had butchered Latin in an attempt to ask where the docks were and if she had seen Finn. The group barely had time to wonder what had happened before the woman darted over to Hiccup, grabbed the front of his shirt, and planted a very deep kiss on his unsuspecting lips. Hiccup had never kissed another woman in his life. Unless, of course, one counted his daughter, but those kisses were quite different. His eyes widened and he was stunned for a moment before he grasped the woman's shoulders and pushed her back. What? He stuttered. Fishlegs. Fishlegs was staring at the woman with almost as shocked an expression. Finn's face was twisted in both disgust and horror. Benen, however, raised his eyebrows and immediately started speaking in Latin to the woman. They babbled back and forth for a bit before Benen let out a shout of laughter. Through his guffaws, he explained something to the woman, who then turned to Hiccup and slapped him in the face. Hiccup's mouth dropped open and his hand flew to his now reddening cheek. Still laughing, Benen turned to the trio. This woman is under the impression that you asked her to marry you, he told Hiccup, wiping tears of mirth out of his eyes. I did what? Hiccup exclaimed. He turned to his friend. What did you tell her, Fishlegs? Apparently not what I thought I told her. Fishlegs said in a voice full of forced nonchalance. I haven't laughed this much in years. Benen chortled. Thank you. You're not going to marry her, are you? Finn asked, his voice sounding quite unsure. Absolutely not. Your mother is the love of my life. And your sister would never forgive me. Hiccup patted Toothless' saddle. But we can't keep them waiting. What do you say, Benen? He turned to the elderly former slave. Want to see what's beyond Mayro? Benen climbed atop Meatlug behind Fishlegs, looking almost at home on top of the dragon. Do you even need to ask? Hiccup laughed, shaking his head. All right, but he said, patting the dragon on the top of the head. Let's go home. Two sets of wings expanded at once and immediately, the ground fell away. Benen watched as Mayro flew farther and farther away until it was a speck on the horizon. He turned back and stared at the vast expanse of ocean ahead of him. His heart leaped with joy. It had taken 42 years, but at last, after all the waiting, after all the optimism, after all the fervent praying, he was free. He looked over at Finn, who stared back at him, and both former slaves lifted their arms into the air, allowing the cool ocean breeze to clear their senses, prepare them for a life away from the evils they had just faced. Hiccup clutched his son with both hands, his heart pounding at the thought of what he would face when he returned home. But the weight he had carried was lifted and his son was coming home. Whatever happened, he could face it. He knew that without a doubt. He rested his cheek against Finn's head and held him closer to his chest. "I love you, buddy." Finn looked up at him with a beaming smile, the corners of his eyes crinkling and mouth split in a grin from the pure joy he felt at finally being free. "Love you too, Dad." Chapter 17, Home Sweet Home. Chapter text. Adriana had a tendency to be a very talkative child, so when she stomped to the Larsens in a rage, several people asked what was wrong. She refused to respond, deciding to sulk for a while before going to the records building and picking out a few simple-to-read books so that she could entertain herself quietly for a while. She considered this decision to be one of the best she'd ever made. The books transported her to new worlds and introduced her to exciting characters. It was slow going since she was new to reading, but she enjoyed herself immensely. In fact, it was dark outside before she realized just how long she had been gone. Vikings weren't big readers, so it was no surprise that no one had walked into the records building. She preferred the still silence. Figuring that it would be wisest to go to the Larsens before the sun set completely, she headed back and kept her head down, staying silent and pretending she was invisible. She didn't want to think about what she'd just heard. On the contrary, she had just read a wonderful story about a girl, much like herself, who had found herself in a magical land far, far away from her dreary home. How Adriana wished she could be like the girl in the book. She certainly wouldn't have to worry about her parents divorcing anymore. Or anything else, really, except where to explore each day. Eric knew his friend was upset without even seeing her very clearly on the path to the house. Her slumped shoulders, hair hanging in front of her face, and hands swinging by her sides were very obvious signals. He mightn't have known it was her at all if he hadn't caught sight of the purple skirt that swished around her knees as she walked and the red flower woven into her blonde locks. She was an easy person to spot in a crowd, but she seemed to be trying to hide herself away. It was for this reason that Eric did not do any more than greet her when she walked in. He watched her walk to his sister's room and shut the door behind her. She didn't emerge all night. The next morning, he was very surprised to find her already out of the house when he was awake. Adriana was not a morning person, neither was he, for that matter, but he generally rose before her. He had a funny feeling in his gut that he should go after her. His best friend was obviously upset, and it didn't do any good to try to bottle it all up inside. It didn't take a lot of thinking to figure out where she had gone. She liked quiet on mornings like this. It was a sunny day, so she was likely to want to spend it outside. He could think of only one place outside that brought her any sort of comfort. Troll Bridge, which was what they had called it when they thought they'd tracked down a sleeping troll beneath it, was their hideaway. It featured a lot of trees to block out the worst of the sun's rays and heavy snow in the winter. The bridge was sturdy but quite old, with weeds and vines covering it, so it almost looked as if nature had made it rather than humans. Beneath the bridge was a creek, though not a deep one. Across the bridge was a cave. Eric and Adriana had ventured into it a little way, but neither of them much liked the dark and were a bit timid about going in too far, especially considering what had happened to Stoic. The cave mostly served as shelter for the rain or heavy snow, but beyond that, they steered clear. They much preferred to pretend they were great adventurers and search for treasure. Their most interesting find had been a fossil. Hiccup had been very interested in it when they showed it to him. He praised his daughter and her friend for their find, and the girl had been all smiles for days. On this particular day, Eric immediately spotted his friend sitting on the bridge, swinging her feet over the edge, and pitching sticks and rocks into the creek. She had no flower in her hair. Though it wasn't intentional on her part, those who knew her best knew that she only forgot to put a flower in her hair on days when she was especially upset. Perhaps the flowers were her way of expressing her cheerfulness. As this was a fairly new habit she'd picked up, Eric wasn't entirely certain, but he could tell from her glum expression that something was wrong. "Hey," he said timidly, walking up to the end of the bridge. "You okay?" His friend didn't respond. She angrily pitched another rock into the creek, where it landed with an audible splash. Eric shifted his weight to his other foot, feeling slightly awkward. Adriana was usually the one who talked most of the time. He enjoyed listening to the many things her brain seemed to conjure up on the spot. A silent Adriana was not a happy Adriana. "Listen, I know something's wrong." Eric took a step forward. Do you want to talk about it? Adriana finally focused her bright green gaze on him. Her brow furrowed. No, she said. I'd rather tell you a story. A story? Yes. Adriana stood up, brushing dirt off her skirt. I've been thinking about it for a while and I know how it begins now. Eric had no idea how to respond to this, so he remained silent. Adriana took this as her cue to begin her story. Once upon a time, she said, her eyes glazing over a bit, the two greatest performers in the world, an escapologist, who could escape from any lock that was ever invented, and an acrobat, who was so skilled it seemed as if she could actually fly, fell in love and got married. She clasped her hands in front of her face, staring at her fingers for a moment before turning back to Eric. They performed some of the most incredible feats together that anyone has ever seen, and people would come from miles around. Kings, queens, traders, and knights. And not just to see their skill, but also to see their love for each other, which was so deep that it was said that gronkles would purr as they passed them. Adriana suddenly trailed off, blinking a few times, her hands beginning to tremble. And monstrous nightmares would weep with joy. She let out a sob, her story nearly forgotten. Her hand moved to her mouth to try to stifle it, but there was no stopping her tears. Eric moved forward. No, I'm okay, she squeaked. Except they didn't love each other. Even though everyone thought they did, because it seemed like they did. Because that's what love really is. It's not real. Anna, what's going on? Eric asked, taking a step forward. Adriana flinched. It doesn't matter. Yes it does. Eric ventured forward again. Come on, Annie, just tell me. Adriana shook her head, but she didn't shy away from him again. My parents are breaking up. What? Why yeah, they were fighting, but I didn't think they'd break up. Adriana sniffled loudly. They're supposed to love each other. Cause if they can't they can't love me or Finn. Not really. Eric had no idea what to say. Adriana usually wanted a hug when she was this upset, but she kept inching away from him. Her arms twitched slightly, almost as if she wanted to throw her arms around him but was afraid of getting hurt once more. Annie. Eric sighed. I'm sorry that's happening. I don't know what to say. Promise me something. Adriana sniffled again and wiped her nose. Promise you're always going to be my friend. Annie. Promise. Cause if you're not, I don't want to be friends anymore. Adriana exclaimed in a rather shrill voice. Eric hesitated for a moment. True, he and Adriana had been friends for over 3 years. But she was a girl and other boys didn't have best friends who were girls. He'd already been teased a few times. But, then again, it wasn't like she could stop being a girl. And, in actuality, he much preferred time with her over time with other boys his age. But friends, forever. Was that even possible? Did people ever stay friends with those they'd been friends with so early on? Would he have to force himself to be friends with her later even if he didn't want to? What if she did something horrible? Would he have to stay friends with her even if the whole village hated her? He looked into her eyes for a moment and knew that that wasn't going to happen. There was no way Adriana, the girl who let the butterflies she caught go, would ever do anything that would make everyone hate her. So, he supposed, she'd never do anything to make him hate her either. Of course, he also hated it when she cried. So much that he would do just about anything to make her feel better. That meant they were best friends, didn't it? Yeah. I promise. Eric said, slowly approaching her and allowing her ample time to run away. I'm not like your parents, Anna. I mean, I won't just give up because it's hard. She shook her head, shuffling backward a bit more. Eric took a confident step forward, reaching out a hand. Anna, do you trust me? Adriana let out a sob and threw herself into his arms. He stumbled backward a bit, not expecting a girl that small to be able to propel herself forward with such force. As she buried her face into his shoulder and let out her tears, he felt his heart flutter a bit. But, even though he thought about it for hours after getting home, he simply couldn't figure out why. Finn had never flown for longer than 30 minutes at a time, But it took much longer than that to get back to Burke. The sun was high in the sky before the familiar island became visible on the horizon. Though he wasn't gone long, he felt slightly nervous. Would his mother be angry at him? Worse still, would his mother be angry at his father? He promised himself that, no matter how bad things got, he wouldn't run away again, but he wasn't sure if he could handle more fighting. As Burke came into view, Hiccup's stomach began to churn. Astrid was somewhere down there. Her note had been a source of comfort, but once she saw him in person, would things change? Everything seemed to have turned upside down for him. He had gone from desperately wanting to escape his life with Astrid to wanting her back more than ever. He was high above his home when he spotted the familiar blonde head in the small crowd that gathered to welcome him home. His wife was standing at the front, patiently waiting for them to land. Finn slid off toothless and was nearly bowled over by his mother. She got on her knees and squeezed him so tightly, his injuries began to throb. But he didn't care, not one bit, because he had missed her so much it had ached. He wanted to cry again, but he held back, wiping his eyes on his mother's shoulder, thankfully devoid of the metal that day. She didn't seem to notice. When they finally broke apart, his tears had ceased and two identical pairs of blue eyes ecstatically locked. "I missed you, Mom," Finn said, his face breaking into a wide smile. "And I'm staying home this time." "I am so sorry, Finn." Astrid leaned forward and kissed her son on his forehead. "And I missed you too, buddy. I promise, no more yelling and fighting." Finn nodded, his cheeks beginning to become sore from all the smiling he had done all day. Astrid ruffled his hair and then looked up just in time to see her husband slip off of his dragon. Their eyes locked. Hiccup swallowed and his eyes quickly dropped to the ground, unable to stay in contact with his wife's any longer. He felt the tears dripping down his face before he could stop them. He couldn't even look at her, he was so ashamed of how he had treated her all this time. Why did any of her behavior give him any excuse to treat her the way he did? And what in the world would ever give her a reason to forgive him? He deserved every hit that she may have in store for him. He deserved every bit of neglect or anger she might inflict on him. He would take it because he deserved every bit of it. Hands were on his face before he could reopen his eyes, thumbs brushing his tears aside. He opened his eyes to see teary azure eyes looking up at him and a forgiving smile on her lips. "Sure," Astrid whispered. Hiccup held onto her wrist and kissed it gently. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Astrid stood on her tiptoes and rested her forehead on his. "We'll talk more later, but I forgive you. I am every bit as much to blame for all of this as you are. I shoved you away. But I don't care what happens from here on out. Know this, I love you, Hiccup Haddock. I love you more than anything in this world." Astrid smiled through her words, fingers brushing into the hair by his ear. A few tears dripped down her cheeks when he saw the love grow in her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere. And neither are the kids. Astrid." Hiccup shook his head with a wistful smile. "Why do you ever put up with me?" Astrid smiled knowingly. "It was part of the contract. I signed up for this for life." Hiccup didn't waste another minute. He pulled his wife into his arms and kissed her as firmly as he could. Astrid's hands rested on his face and she giggled when he lifted her off the ground. The villagers cheered and whistled around them, but went ignored. It was the longest kiss they had shared in forever and nothing could break them apart. Except their son, who growled in disgust. Blick. Astrid broke the kiss with a breathy smile but didn't pull back. She rested her forehead on her husband's and met his eyes. So green, so full of life again, so full of mischief and love and devotion and passion. She brushed her thumbs over his eyebrows and down to his cheeks. "I missed you." Hiccup smirked. "I missed me too." She slapped his arm, making a few jerk in surprise. Hiccup grinned. "But I missed you more." Arms growing tired, he finally set her down on the ground in front of him. Small arms wrapped around his waist and he looked to see an identical pair of green eyes looking up at him. He nearly cried with relief. The last time he had seen her, she hadn't looked so beautiful, so innocent, so kind and gentle. Adriana was safe and she was his. "Addie," he pulled her into his arms and also lifted her off the ground. Adriana hugged her daddy as tight as he could without strangling him. A few tears slipped out of her eyes and she too knew that her daddy was back. He wasn't angry, he stood tall and handsome again, eyes bright and kind and happy. She couldn't be happier. "I'm sorry I didn't hug you sooner," he whispered. "It's okay, Daddy," Adriana whispered back. "You needed to be with Mommy first." She glanced over to her mother and then back at her father. "So, you love each other again?" Astrid breathed a laugh and gently smoothed out her daughter's hair. "We never stopped." "Not really." "But you said." "I know, Addie. Sometimes people make bad choices when they're mad, or scared, or stressed. But that doesn't mean they mean all the mean things they say." Hiccup paused for a second. "That makes sense." Adriana nodded, wiping her eyes again as fresh, blissfully happy tears began to drip down her face. Astrid reached into her satchel and brought out a small pile of papers. "Well, I don't think we'll be needing these anymore," she said with a grin, handing the divorce papers to her daughter. "What do you think we should do with them?" Adriana giggled and ripped them in half, crumpling them in her fists. There were sighs of relief all over the crowd. She then made eye contact with Toothless and tossed them his way. The Night Fury shot a plasma blast at them, igniting the papers and leaving them unrecognizable. "Well, looks like our family has weathered yet another storm," Hiccup said, beckoning for Finn to come closer and placing a hand on his shoulder. "And we got through it, just like we always do. And we always will." Astrid kissed her husband on the cheek. "I promise." "Well," said Binnen, stepping forward and causing several onlookers to wonder when he had come from, "I don't know what your problems were, but you, strong Finn, have the most beautiful family I have ever seen." Astrid beamed and looked down at her son. "And who is this gentleman?" Finn beamed. "Mom, this is Binnen. He was my..." He paused, rather embarrassed for the surrounding villagers to hear the word slave. Especially his group of friends standing close by. "Mentor." Finn gestured to his mother. "Binnen, this is my mom, Astrid." Binnen beamed at him. He patted the boy's shoulder lovingly before turning to Astrid and dipping his head and taking her hand in his. "'Tis a pleasure to meet you, milady," he said as he kissed her fingers. Astrid smirked at Hiccup. "Oh, a man after my own heart." Hiccup snorted, unable to keep the smirk off his face. Binnen let go of Astrid's hand and got down on his knees in front of Adriana. "And you must be Finn's young sister, Adriana." He took her hand and kissed it as well. Adriana giggled and blushed, she had never been treated like a lady before. "Lovely name. As lovely as your eyes. Just like your father's." Hiccup raised his eyebrows. "Are you saying I have lovely eyes, Binnen?" "You said it, not me." "One should not be so prideful, Chief." Hiccup gaped. Several people laughed at Binen's triumphant smirk. For a former slave and being silent for so long, Binnen sure had a witty sense of humor. "Oh, I definitely like him," Astrid said, nudging her husband as he helped Binnen back to his feet. "There's gonna be a war of the wits before long." Hiccup smirked. Adriana grinned as well, one hand resting on her hip. "I could join it too." "Oh, sassy that one." Binnen chuckled, poking Hiccup's arm. "She's going to be a fun teenager. I look forward to it." Hiccup deadpanned. "Well," Gobber said, stepping forward and facing Hiccup and Astrid, "I'm sure you want to catch up. I can take the kids to my workshop for a bit. And Binnen too, he needs new clothes and I'm sure I can resize some of my old clothes so he can wear them before getting some of his own." "Thank you, sir." Binnen cheerfully shook Gobber's hand. "I would be most honored. I can show you around too." Finn added. "I can't imagine a better way to spend an afternoon," Binnen said, the smile just about plastered to his face. "Lead the way." Hiccup and Astrid watched their young son and his newest friend until they were out of sight. Adriana stood, hands clasped behind her back. She wanted to come too, but she thought it would be best for Finn to do this alone. "What do you say, Anna? Another reading lesson?" Gobber offered. "You mean, archery?" Adriana's smile widened when Gobber nodded. "Can Eric come too?" Gobber looked over at the wavy-haired boy and back to Adriana. He didn't know Eric very well, but it couldn't hurt give him a few lessons as well. He nodded again and led the boy and girl to his workshop. I guess that leaves us. Hiccup turned to his wife. Hiccup held out his hand, which Astrid took without thought or question. They turned toward the path to their house, smiling at everyone they passed. Not many people stopped to talk, a couple waved or nodded back, a few scowled and turned away to their homes or stores. Hiccup swallowed the knot in his throat, he owed the village an apology as well. This thought led to another before he found himself thinking of his possible removal from office. But not right now. He needed to focus on Astrid and only Astrid right now. Even if they did remove him from office, his only responsibility was fixing his marriage. Because even as some people had told him already, if he couldn't handle his marriage, how could he possibly handle an entire village? They walked in silence and before they knew it, their house appeared before them. Smoke blew out of the chimney, presumably from a meal cooking or boiling water for laundry. Emotion bubbled in Hiccup's chest at seeing their home again. A knot formed in his throat again at what he had planned to do in order to rid himself of the pain he had been feeling. He never wanted to see this place again, the house that he nearly built with his own hands, the house that he and his wife started their new life together and that his children were growing up in. He stopped in front of the door, the wooden step creaking underneath his prosthetic. Astrid looked at him with a look of concern to see tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. How selfish could he possibly get to leave his wife and children for all eternity? Astrid pulled his hand to her chest, regaining his attention again. She smiled at him tenderly and continued up the steps, pulling him after her. Hiccup stepped into the house, surges of emotion beginning to rage as Astrid closed the door. She stood in front of him again and Hiccup nearly broke down right there. Astrid. Astrid, I'm sorry. Hiccup choked. Astrid wrapped her arms around him, tears of her own springing to her eyes. Honey, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, her husband sobbed into her shoulder. I forgive you, I promise, Hiccup. Astrid tried to soothe him, but he couldn't stop. That doesn't change the fact that I treated you like absolute garbage, Astrid. Hiccup stared at her with puffy eyes. His exhaustion wasn't lost on her. He may be back to his old self, but he certainly hadn't slept well in a long time. Astrid brushed his bangs out of his eyes. Before voicing her thoughts, she pulled him over to the couch so they could sit and talk more comfortably. They sat side by side, arms wrapped around each other, hands moving hair or brushing each other's face. The tenderness of physical contact was needed and necessary. You weren't very nice. At all. Astrid sighed, forcing him to maintain eye contact. You were angry all the time. You hated being in the same room as me, so you wouldn't try. You wouldn't talk or even look me in the eye. Tears rolled down her face and Hiccup opened his mouth to apologize again, but she stopped him with a few fingers on his lips. No, please let me finish. Hiccup bit his lip and nodded for her to continue. You were selfish and hateful and impatient and cruel. But you didn't get that way on your own. Astrid. No. Hiccup, I said just as many hateful things. I shoved you away, I acted just as self-righteous and proud as you did. Astrid licked her lips and took a calming breath. When I married you, I made a promise to you to stand by you when you needed me and aid you when you were hurt or distressed, to help you fight your fights. Those fights aren't just physical, they're also emotional. The fights up here, Astrid tapped his temple with a single finger, are just as important as the fights out there. She nodded toward the window. I didn't help you or stand by you. You risked everything, your family, your tribe and your own life. You've even got the scars to prove it. Astrid ran her fingers down the long scar on his neck. All I did was spit you in the face for it. Hiccup sniffed and shrugged. I guess I could have used a little support. We're getting there. Astrid smiled a little. You needed every single bit of support I could muster. Her fingers dove into his hair and massaged his scalp while he hummed appreciatively. I said it before and I'll say it again, I love you, Hiccup, and I forgive you for everything. Just promise me you won't ever turn into that monster again. I promise. Hiccup replied instantly with conviction. And I forgive you too. Gods, how was he going to say this? I'm sorry that I didn't plan to come back. It's surreal to think that I was ever that far gone. Astrid nodded, still brushing her fingers through his hair. What changed your mind? Hiccup pursed his lips and she felt him tense. I had a nightmare, he nearly whispered, eyes downcast. Astrid was afraid to ask him, but she knew he needed to talk about it. What happened? Hiccup sighed, pulling her hand from his hair to hold it. I'll start at the beginning, but brace yourself. Nothing could have prepared Astrid for the horrific experience her husband had endured in his subconscious. In the end she had to be honest. Yes, the nightmare snapped her husband back into his old self, but she never would have wished it to have been this terrifying, this painful, this full of torture. The nightmare was the embodiment of all things abominable. Tears dripped down his face when retelling the dream, his face full of anguish when he told her how their children died, Addie by Dager's very hands, Finn by a mob of callous, heartless people. Astrid shivered herself when told of the abuse she endured, the pain of losing her children after her husband's death, and her blood ran cold at the scene of Dager's death by her own hand. Hiccup's hands shook as he told the tale and his voice wobbled, and he didn't refrain from telling the details as he didn't know how he could explain without downplaying anything. The couple had lost track of time when Hiccup finally stopped speaking. A lock of golden hair fallen from her braid run around his forefinger, an easy distraction from her probing eyes. She cocked her head to catch his finally drying eyes. I'm sorry, Astrid sighed. I've never heard of a nightmare that bad. Hiccup shivered. I just hope it never happens again. I mean, I'm back to my old self and I'm trying, really trying to let Braun and Dager go. But I have the feeling that it won't just happen one time and never again, he smiled wistfully. Why is it sleep is one thing I need so dearly, yet no matter what I do it escapes me. Sleep will come. You still have me, after all. Astrid smiled and kissed his forehead. Hiccup hummed thoughtfully. Really? He gently pushed her bangs behind her ear as he continued, how's that? Because that mischievous glint in your eyes couldn't possibly put me to sleep. Astrid's smirk widened. Not until I wear you out first. Hiccup's eyes widened and jaw dropped before Astrid seized his mouth with hers, roughly pushing his back against the couch. A squeak of surprise sounded from Hiccup's throat before a thrill swooped through his stomach. Astrid's mouth moved fast and hot against his, which he hadn't felt in, he couldn't even remember. He didn't think he'd ever experience anything like this with her again. He felt his breath hitch as his brain crackled with memories and tried to catch up with her. A moan escaped him when she bit his lip, sending shivers through him. Astrid. He murmured. Hush. Astrid commanded without preamble before capturing his mouth again. Her hands pulled at his leather vest and buttoned shirt below before her nails began to scrape his collarbone. Hiccup moaned again at the pain and pleasure of it, and finally his limbs caught up with her movements. He grasped her by the hips and pulled her into his lap, making her squeal in surprise. His hands ghosted her waist and traveled the planes of her back before his fingers found her hair. He drew his lips away from hers to warmly caress her neck while he pulled the ties and pins out of her long locks. Astrid gasped and sighed at every kiss on her sensitive skin below her ear and the curve of her neck. Tendrils of curly golden hair enveloped him when he finally loosed her braid and he hummed happily at the overwhelming scent of honey and mint. Astrid pressed her thin frame closer against his, her knees pressing to his ribcage in a hot straddle that sent eager shivers through him. A little voice in the back of his mind pointed out that, yes, he had indeed chosen the most amazing woman in the world to marry. His fingers dove into her hair to pull her impossibly closer, their mouths inseparable. His fingers tucked under the belt of her skirt, searching for the hem of her shirt. Blue orbs hovered over green as she drew away for a moment and swiftly pulled her blue shirt over her head in one fluid movement. He smirked but was internally dismayed to find a white undershirt still in the way, but that didn't stop him from planting a kiss on the hollow of her throat and slowly making his way down. Astrid shoved her hands into his hair and pressed him closer, a hot sigh escaping her throat and sounding in his ear. Hiccup. She whimpered, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing his temple. How long has it been? Hiccup sighed and pulled his head up, shaking her loose hair away from his eyes. I haven't the foggiest. Well then, my husband. Astrid gave him her most seductive expression, which she was pleased to see replicated. I do believe it is time to change that. Astrid placed one foot on the ground, grabbed her shirt with one hand and her husband's hand with the other and yanked him to his feet. Hiccup laughed in surprise when his beautiful, amazing wife nearly dragged him up the stairs. He silently thanked the gods he didn't trip on the way up. Reaching the master bedroom, Hiccup kicked the door closed with his prosthetic, and the world and all its problems were soon forgotten. Chapter 18, Redemption. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Astrid liked the feeling a warm body in bed next to her. She hadn't noticed how much she'd desired it until Hiccup had stopped sleeping in the master bedroom for weeks at a time. And even when he did, he never stayed until morning and certainly never touched her. All this had changed in the span of one wonderful afternoon. They napped for an hour, both feeling quite worn out by the day's activities, and awoke as the sun was high in the sky. Hiccup awoke first, his arms around his beautiful wife and his body feeling relaxed for the first time in far too long. He breathed in the familiar mint and honey scent of her hair, smiling to himself at the memory of the events following their impromptu nap. Astrid awoke a few minutes later, happy to feel strong arms around her waist, gently stroking the silky smooth nightshirt she'd slipped on before curling into his arms. She heard him sigh with contentment just above her head. "Hey," she said as she turned her body so that she faced her husband. "Hey," he replied, reaching up and brushing some loose strands of hair from in front of her face. "How did you sleep?" she whispered, fingers brushing against Hiccup's cheek and making their way down to his chest. Hiccup smiled. "Best sleep I've had in weeks. And that was just for an hour. Imagine the kind of sleep you'll have tonight." Astrid placed her hand behind her husband's shoulder and gently pulled him in. "You've got something you didn't have before." "Me? Don't I know it?" Hiccup kissed her on the forehead. "Thank you." "For what?" "Forgiving me. I didn't deserve it." Hiccup gently ran his fingers through her hair. "That's the thing about forgiveness. No one deserves it. But that's why we have to. Because we don't either." "Are you always this philosophical or is that new?" "Our daughter may have rubbed off on me. A little. A little, huh?" Hiccup chuckled. "Okay, sure. Speaking of which." Astrid's voice became serious. "She had an incident. 2 nights ago. And I've been thinking about it but I can't make sense of it." "What sort of incident? Is she okay?" "She's fine. Well, she acted okay the next day. But I didn't bring it up." Astrid paused. "Has she ever mentioned anything about an escapologist? Maybe in a nightmare or just in general?" Hiccup furrowed his brow. "Does she know what that is?" "We've never had one come to perform. Haven't in, gods, a little over 20 years. "That's what I thought. But we were reading this book and the word escapologist came up and she threw the book across the room. Wouldn't touch it again and then was sort of far away. Like reliving something." Astrid's eyebrow furrowed at the memory, concern for her daughter taking over her features. It warmed Hiccup's heart to see her concerned for their daughter about something. Hiccup's eyes closed briefly. "A flashback. That's odd." Astrid nodded in agreement. "That's what I thought too. What do you think it means?" Hiccup sighed. "I think it means we don't know the full story." Astrid huffed and sprawled back on the bed. Hiccup leaned on his elbow to look down at her, his fingers rubbing the material of her nightgown at her hip. "That's what I was afraid of. So now what do we do?" Hiccup frowned in thought, his fingers gently trailing across her stomach. "We can't confront her. I guess we'll just hope she tells us one day." They were silent for a few moments until Astrid turned her head to face him. "Is that all we can do?" "Pretty much," Hiccup replied through pursed lips. Astrid raised her right hand and pushed her fingers through his hair, pulling a warm sigh from his throat. Her nails gently pulled against the back of his neck. She grinned when Hiccup bit his lips to keep from moaning in pleasure and begging her to stop driving him absolutely insane. "How was Finn?" Hiccup rested his hand on her belly as he gathered his thoughts. He told her of the evil slave master Ratri and his plot to have him killed so he could keep Finn as a slave. He told her of his reunion with Finn in the belly of the cave and all the injuries on Finn's young body from the man's beatings. "He'll probably have scars for the rest of his life. I'll have to treat those. I can't imagine him letting us take him to the healers." So her eyes lowered for a moment as she processed this information. Why did Ratri make you go into that cave in the first place? I think he caused the cave-in to kill me so I wouldn't be able to retrieve Finn. Hiccup shook his head. But I can't even begin to explain to you the thought processes of a man like that. Astrid's face darkened. If I could get my hands on that sick, twisted pig, I'd. I know. Hiccup nodded. Believe me, I know. I'm thankful he didn't have to stay in that place for long and that he met Benin. You can say that again. Astrid pushed his shoulder so he lay back on the bed. She leaned over him, her hair casting a curtain over him that blocked out everything but framed her eyes. He smiled up at her. What? We need to make some changes. Hiccup laughed. Yeah, we do. First off, we are doing this more often. We're not putting this off for that long again. Hiccup hummed. I think I can live with that. I figured. Astrid winked. Second, we're going to give each of our kids equal attention. I'm going to spend more time with Adri, and... Adri. Astrid nodded with a smile. Yeah. My nickname for her, we decided. I like it. Hiccup said, resting his head on her shoulder. Anyway, and you're going to spend more time with Finn, and not just to teach him about chiefly duties. Agreed. Silence permeated the room again. Astrid turned her head to look at him after a couple minutes. His eyes met hers and he raised his eyebrows questioningly. Astrid grinned devilishly and pushed his shoulders back on the bed, ignoring his surprised gasp. She wrapped her leg around his hip and pulled herself on top of him, giggling at his widening eyes. Resting her chin on her hands, elbows on either side of his head, she peered down at him with a seductive smile. How about another round? Hiccup scoffed a laugh, but couldn't resist resting his hands on her lower back. Do you want to wear me out? I still have to pick up the kids. I could pick them up. Hiccup ignored the seriousness in her voice and turned his head away from her probing lips. You could. He nudged her face away from his neck with his nose. But I think it would be better if I did it. I'm not that tired and irresponsible, besides. Astrid pouted. Hiccup. Astrid footed. Hiccup whined back before he was struck with inspiration. With a triumphant smirk, Hiccup dug his fingers into her waist just below her ribs. Astrid screamed indignantly and tried to scramble off of him. No, stop. Hiccup wrapped his right leg around her left, keeping her from fleeing. Her laughs echoed through the bedroom until she finally managed to wriggle free. Before she could fully escape, Hiccup floored them over so he lay on top of her. He held one of her wrists down with his knee and ignored her frantic screams for mercy. He laughed triumphantly when she began to scream even louder at his probing fingers, tears of mirth dripping down her face. Hiccup only stopped when she began to cough and finally roared, "Don't make kick you." Sitting back on his knees, sitting over hers, he grinned down at her. She clutched her sides as she tried to catch her breath, her blue eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. A moment later she finally wheezed, "Payback will be sweet, my dear." Hiccup gulped and nervously giggled. "I look forward to it." He swung his legs over the bed and reached for his button-down shirt. He frowned when he looked at it, sighing as he realized that this was his only clean shirt from his travels. He raised an eyebrow at Astrid, who merely smirked at him. "One more stitch should do it, and there you go." Benin smiled proudly. "One perfect cloth flower, if I do say so myself. And now you can continue to wear them in the winter." Adriana beamed at the elderly man, pulling apart the string and tucking it under the flower so that the stitches would hold. She admired her work, eyes wide with wonder. Had she really made something so pretty all on her own? Well, it wasn't all her, she'd had a very good teacher. "Why don't you try it on?" Benin suggested. Adriana clipped the flower into her hair and looked at the former slave. "Beautiful. You should make more. Purple suits you quite well, but there's a whole rainbow of colors that would make your lovely smile brighter." "Thank you, Benin. Where did you learn to make these?" Adriana asked, hopping over to a mirror to take a look for herself. "Long ago, I was in love with a woman who liked to wear flowers much like you do." Benin sighed, a small smile brightening his features as his thoughts turned to Aida. I used to make them for her and leave them where she could find them. I am so happy I haven't lost my touch. Finn shook his head, his nose crinkling. Anna's already girly enough. Well, dear boy, your sister is a girl. Benen chuckled. And one day, you might find femininity more appealing. I don't think so. Finn placed his chin in his hand. Girls are so weird. Just because you and I may not understand them doesn't mean they are, as you put it, weird. Benen placed a hand on the boy's knee. It is through our differences that we learn to appreciate each other. Well said. Hiccup exclaimed from the forge's window. Well, Benen, I see you've kept my kids happy while my wife and I have been patching up our relationship. Your family is wonderful, Hiccup. I am happy to help. Benen replied. Though your friend Gobber has been offering much needed assistance. He showed your son here how to make an arrowhead. And then your daughter shot it through the target over there. He gestured to a target with an arrow directly in the center. She has a good eye. That she does. Hiccup walked into the forge and was nearly bowled over by his little girl. Easy there, Addie. I missed you. Adriana's voice was slightly muffled since her head was pressed into her daddy's leather vest. I missed you too, sweetie. Hiccup gently pried her arms off his waist and took a good look at her. That flower makes you look very pretty. Did Benen show you how to make it? Yeah, he did. And he's going to help me make others too. Adriana exclaimed with a gleeful hop. Now Benen Hiccup turned to the elderly man, who serenely met his gaze. If you turn my daughter into the prettiest girl on Burke, I'm going to have to fight the boys off my lawn. It's a risk I'm willing to take. Benen stood and playfully tugged a strand of the girl's hair. Not that she needs my help. Adriana blushed scarlet. Finn, however, had his eyes fixed on the shirt his father wore under the vest. Dad, he said, one eyebrow raised. Where did all your buttons go? Gobber, who had just walked into the room, snorted and covered his mouth with a hand. Hiccup shot a glare in his direction before turning back to his son, his mind racing. Your mother didn't like them. In fact, I don't think she likes this shirt, he said, pulling the open shirt closed as best he could. Thankfully, his son didn't press the issue. And I know I can't make it up to you all at once. I only ask for a second chance so that I can prove how truly sorry I am for what I put the village through these last 2 years. Hiccup stopped to take a breath, his eyes focused on his wife in the back of the room, who beamed at him. I come to you without any pointless excuses. There was no excusing my behavior. But can you find it in your hearts to forgive me? Snotlout slowly got to his feet, looking his chief directly in the eye. We promised to stand by you until the end. We're not letting you go that easily. Yeah. And besides, if you stopped being chief, Snotlout would have to take over. Tough Nut added with a smirk. And he hasn't done any of the awesome things you've done. As Snotlout hastily retorted, Hiccup's eyes scanned the crowd. His friends all looked at him with a renewed resolve to stand by him no matter what. But several others weren't as forgiving. He watched as a small group of people left the great hall, not bothering to keep their footsteps silent. He sighed to himself. It was up to him to make it up to them one by one. His disappointment lasted only moments. He soon felt 2 pairs of arms around his waist as his children came up to the platform to express their forgiveness. Rough Nut punched him in the shoulder, but her smile assured him that it wasn't meant to be malicious. Heather gave him a quick, one-armed hug as her husband clapped him on the back. But it was Olaf Larsson's words that ended up meaning the most to him long after that night was over. He wheeled over and reached up to shake Hiccup's hand. I don't think I've ever heard a better apology, he said cheerfully. I don't need to do any more than look at the way you embrace your children and your wife to know that we have our old chief back. You will lead us well. Thank you, Olaf. Hiccup's smile widened. You don't know how much your forgiveness means to me. As a man who has made many mistakes, I assure you that I do. Olaf chuckled. Welcome home, Chief. Thank you. Hiccup said, looking out at the crowd of people who had forgiven him and at his family, who all looked at him lovingly. It's good to be back. No. Please, I'm sorry. I'll go back and get what you want. But you didn't. Finn dodged the cane, skidding across the wood on his stomach, vaguely aware of the glass shards underneath his bare skin. You didn't specify what to buy. Please don't hurt me. Finn begged, curling into a fetal position with his arms covering his head. Rattray raised the cane, a horrible glint in his eyes, and brought it down. Finn awoke with a gasp, his body covered in sweat and his heart pounding in his ears. He trembled for a moment, forgetting that he was no longer on Mayro and that Rattray was far away. That Rattray could never hurt him again. For a moment, the boy considered going into his parents' room and asking if he could crawl into bed with them. He knew that their warmth would make him feel safe, would comfort him. But he wasn't Adriana. He wasn't weak. And he wasn't going to cry about his fears or his nightmares the way everyone else did. He crawled under his covers again and shut his eyes, willing his mind to go blank again. He wouldn't think about it. Maybe then the nightmares would cease. Up. Get up. Astrid groaned, pulling the covers over her head. Her husband laughed, trying to tug them from her grip. No, come on, she moaned sleepily. Astrid, honey, you promised. Hiccup leaned down and kissed the top of her head, which was all that was visible thanks to the blankets. Okay, okay. Astrid tossed the covers off her head and captured Hiccup's lips with her own. I'm up. Hiccup skipped over to the dresser and pulled on his clothes as fast as he could. Gods, we need to do this more often. Calm down or you'll wear yourself out before we wake up the kids. Astrid laughed, now trying to get dressed as fast as him. Impossible. Hiccup grinned and threw open the door, taking a deep breath and enjoying the fresh morning air. Addie. Finn. Wake up. Two doors opened a minute later as the twins hurriedly emerged and pounded down the stairs. The four haddocks stopped on the last step, all feeling slightly sheepish. Bennen was sitting at the table, an amused expression on his face. Quite the early risers, aren't you? He asked with a grin. It's been a long time since I've seen so much energy at the crack of dawn. Hiccup looked over to the couch where the elderly man had slept and was relieved to note that it had been smoothed out, indicating that Bennen had risen before him and his family. We're going flying. Adriana squealed. A good reason to rise early. Bennen chuckled. I'll be going to give you four some time with each other. I should go looking for a place to stay, he sighed. Goodness, it's been a long time since I had somewhere to call my own. Come by this evening and I'll help you move. Hiccup said. But first, you need to eat. Oh no, I couldn't possibly impose. Bennen protested. Nonsense. Astrid reached into the cupboards to take out copious amounts of food. You are no imposition. Finn sat down and, once Astrid passed him a big bowl of berry porridge, scooped a generous amount into his mentor's bowl. Adriana did the same with the scrambled eggs her mother passed her. Why, there's enough on my plate to feed a small army. Bennen exclaimed, pushing the plate forward. I couldn't. You are going to eat all of that. Astrid insisted. And you're going to keep eating until Finn won't risk getting a parchment cut if he gives you a hug. But. No arguments. Hiccup said, pushing the plate toward the former slave. Bennen looked down at his plate and then back at Astrid, who had just sat down and was passing the food around the table. Tears filled his eyes. Oh Bennen, don't cry. Adriana whimpered, reaching across the table, nearly putting her elbow in the bowl of porridge as she did so, to wipe the man's tears. I'm sorry. Bennen wept, smiling through his tears at the haddock girl's kindness. I don't mean to upset you. But no one has treated me this way in a very long time. Get used to it, Bennen. Hiccup placed a hand on the man's wrist. Burke is going to love you. I can promise that. When breakfast had ended, Bennen easily ate everything on his plate and even accepted seconds at Astrid's insistence. The family made their way to a nearby cliff, dragons at their heels, while Bennen made his way to the village. Hiccup looked up at the almost completely clear sky and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time, excitement. All right, Addie, he said, turning to his daughter, give me your hand and I'll hoist you onto Toothless here. Adriana looked at the Night Fury with a furrowed brow before turning to her father. Daddy, I love you very, very much, but can I ride with Mommy today? Well, Hiccup turned to his wife, who looked so touched she might actually shed a tear, Who am I to keep a girl from her mother? He turned to Finn. I guess that leaves you with me, buddy. What do you say? Want to show the girls who rules the skies? Finn opened his mouth to respond when suddenly a large bag dropped to the ground right in front of his father. Hiccup bent over and picked it up, eyebrow raised, as Pipsqueak landed on his shoulder. What's that? Adriana asked, making herself comfortable atop Stormfly. It looks like. Hiccup opened the bag. It is. Oh good girl, Pipsqueak. It is what? Astrid raised an eyebrow. It's the bag of money I used to pay Ratri. Hiccup let out a shout of laughter. Pipsqueak must have thought we left it behind by accident. You mean you got Binnen and me for free? Finn's mouth split into a wide smile. Ratri must be so mad. I bet he is. Hiccup wiped tears of mirth out of his eyes. No slaves and no money. I wish I could see his face. The haddocks laughed, quite pleased that the cruel man had gotten at least a little bit of what he deserved. Finn looked up and thanked the gods that Ratri wouldn't be able to purchase any more slaves for the time being. Well, Astrid climbed onto Stormfly behind her daughter. Ready to show the boys what we're made of. Adriana nodded eagerly. They waited for Hiccup to mount Toothless before shooting like an arrow into the sky. As they flew, the haddock family all breathed deeply, enjoying the crisp morning air and the view of their island growing smaller and smaller as they flew closer to the clouds. Astrid put her arms around her daughter. True, she and Adriana still didn't have as much in common as they might have liked, but all the tension was gone. The female haddocks felt like they had found all the common ground they needed. Adriana was excited to learn everything her mother had to teach her. And, though she didn't know it, Astrid was just as excited to teach her as she was to learn from her. The little girl had already taught her mother so many important lessons. Almost as many as her mother had taught her. And that was only the beginning. Hiccup felt his son lean back into his chest as the Night Fury flew higher into the sky. He still felt guilty for treating his little man as horribly as he had over the last few months. He hoped that Finn would continue to allow him to make it up to him. He didn't know it, but Finn prayed that he could stay close to his father for the rest of his life. The boy knew that there was so much left to learn. And that he and Hiccup would learn it all together. And so the haddocks, all feeling like their hearts were bursting with excitement and love for each other, ascended into the clouds. They didn't notice, but an old man watched them until they disappeared, thanking the gods for each and every one of them. This is Berk. It's the kind of place that looks peaceful all the time. Sure, we have our spats, but at the end of the day, our anger dissipates and we all go to bed in good spirits. That being said, sometimes our darkest thoughts and feelings can become stowaways in our minds. We may go about life not knowing that they are there, but they always turn up sooner or later. And when they take over and turn us into the people we detest, it may be too late to change things. But what can we do when these mental and emotional stowaways come seemingly out of nowhere and wreak havoc on our lives? How can we deal with them when they turn up in ourselves or in the ones we love? There is only one cure, and that is forgiveness. Only then can we address the problems and attempt to move on. The end.